a black doctor, exhausted from saving lives on the front lines, was finally heading home to see his family. But when he arrived at the airport, everything changed. A gate agent targeted him with blatant disrespect, questioning his credentials and humiliating him in front of other passengers. Just 10 minutes later, the tables turned in a way no one expected, leading to consequences that left everyone stunned. What happened next sparked a conversation about dignity, bias, and justice that you won't want to miss. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment and share where you're tuning in from today. And if this story resonates, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary day. The airport was alive, bustling with hurried footsteps and fractured voices. An orchestra of modern urgency. Lena Marshall, a woman of calm elegance, strode into the terminal. Her tailored navy blazer fit her like resolve itself, her polished leather suitcase wheeling obediently behind her. Her presence was quiet but commanding, the kind that drew attention not by demand but by the certainty of her being. The first ripple came at the check-in counter. "Good morning," Lena said, her voice smooth as silk yet firm as steel, sliding her first-class ticket across the counter. The attendant, a young woman named Kara, glanced at her with an expression Lena recognized immediately. Not outright disdain, no, but the subtle narrowing of the eyes, the slightest tightening of the mouth. It was the look of someone recalibrating expectations, trying to reconcile Lena's poise with whatever preconceptions lingered just beneath the surface. Kara took the ticket and hesitated, just long enough for Lena to notice. The pause was not procedural, it was performative. A quiet assertion of power in a space where Lena was presumed to be out of place. "Flying first class today?" Kara asked, her smile barely holding. "Yes," Lena replied evenly, her tone giving no ground to the condescension hanging in the air. Kara turned to her colleague, a man named Steve, whose broad frame and casual slouch spoke of a comfort Lena envied. Kara didn't need to say anything, her raised eyebrow and subtle smirk did the work for her. Steve chuckled under his breath, taking the ticket and holding it up to the light as if it were counterfeit. The moment stretched, the silence between them sharp and deliberate. Lena's chest tightened, but she refused to flinch. Her gaze stayed steady, meeting Kara's with a calm resilience that spoke to years of practice. Practice she wished she didn't need. "Looks legit," Steve finally said, handing the ticket back with a shrug that bordered on mockery. "Guess you're good to go." Lena didn't thank him, she simply nodded, reclaiming her ticket with a grace that felt, even to her, like an act of defiance. The second ripple was less subtle. At the baggage drop, an older man named Frank took her suitcase without a word. His movements brusque, with a flick of his wrist. He tossed it onto the conveyor belt as though it were a bag of refuse. Not the carefully packed belongings of a paying customer. The force of the throw sent the suitcase teetering before it slammed onto its side. One of the smaller pouches bursting open. "Excuse me," Lena said, her voice low but firm. "Could you please handle that with more care?" Frank barely glanced at her. "It's just luggage," he muttered, scooping up the fallen bag and throwing it back onto the belt with the same indifference. "It's my property," Lena countered, her words clipped but restrained. The restraint itself felt like a burden, the weight of knowing she couldn't afford to be seen as angry, no matter how justified she might be. Frank shrugged, muttering something under his breath that Lena didn't catch but didn't need to. The message was clear enough: you don't matter. Not here. By the time she reached the boarding gate, the air felt heavier, the whispers had grown, not louder but sharper, slicing through her composure like 1,000 tiny cuts. The gate agent, Phil, scanned tickets with practiced efficiency until Lena stepped forward. His movements slowed, his brow furrowing as though her first-class ticket required an extra layer of scrutiny. "Just making sure everything's in order," he said, his tone coated with an artificial politeness that barely concealed the undercurrent of suspicion. Lena said nothing, though the words gathered in her throat like a storm. She knew this dance too well. The insinuations, the questioning, the unspoken accusation that her very presence was an anomaly that needed justification. When the scanner beeped green, Phil handed back her ticket with an exaggerated smile. First class. Huh? Special occasion? Lena met his gaze, her expression as unmoving as the mountains. Every occasion is special, she said, her tone leaving no room for rebuttal. As she moved past the gate, she caught the whispers behind her. The not-so-quiet chuckles. The words spoken just loud enough for her to hear. Bet she won it in a sweepstakes. Phil muttered to his colleague, whose laughter rang out like a slap. Lena's steps faltered for the briefest moment, the weight of their words pressing against her like the hum of a distant train, growing louder with each passing second. But she didn't turn around. She didn't let them see the storm brewing inside her. Not yet. By the time she settled into her seat in first class, Lena felt the tension in her shoulders like an old wound flaring to life. The flight attendants greeted other passengers with warm smiles and attentive service, their voices lilting with welcome. But when they reached her, the smiles dimmed, the tones clipped. A young attendant named Claire hovered over her, checking and rechecking her ticket as though expecting it to reveal some flaw. "You're in seat 2A, correct?" Claire asked, though the information was plainly written in bold letters. "Yes," Lena replied, her patience thinning. "Just making sure," Claire murmured, stepping aside but not before casting a glance over her shoulder as though to confirm Lena hadn't somehow slipped into first class by mistake. The plane had yet to take off, but the journey had already begun. It was not a journey across the skies but through the labyrinth of unspoken hierarchies. The quiet warfare of assumptions and microaggressions that followed Lena like shadows. And though she carried herself with dignity, with the poise of someone who had endured this 1,000 times before, she knew the weight of those shadows would never truly lift. Not until she forced them to see her. The chapter ends not with resolution but with anticipation. The quiet fire in Lena's eyes signaling that the storm she carried would not stay quiet for long. The cabin was bathed in the sterile glow of overhead lights, a perfect contrast to the smoldering unease that filled Lena Marshall's chest. Outside the window, the tarmac stretched endlessly under the deepening sky. But Lena's focus was on the space within, the cramped corridors of first-class civility, where the tension hummed just beneath the surface like a hidden fault line. The first challenge came not with words, but with absence. The attendants moved up and down the aisle, handing out drinks, offering warm towels, smiling with the kind of practiced hospitality reserved for people deemed worthy of care. When they reached Lena's row, the warmth evaporated. "Would you like a drink, the attendant?" Claire asked, her tone distant, her smile a shadow of what it had been moments before. Lena looked up from her book. "Water, please." Claire nodded, returning moments later with a glass that she placed on Lena's tray without a word, her hand already moving away before the glass even settled. The dismissal was as clear as the water itself. Lena said nothing, but the message settled heavily in the space between them. "You are here, but you are not welcome." As the plane began to taxi, Lena glanced around, observing the subtle hierarchies that played out like clockwork. A man in a tailored suit gestured for an attendant, and she bent toward him with a smile so warm it felt personal. A woman with a pearl necklace asked for assistance with her carry-on, and 2 attendants sprang into action, their voices soft and reassuring. Lena remained silent, her fingers grazing the armrest as she tried to steady herself. She was used to this quiet confirmation that her presence in spaces like this was tolerated but never embraced. Yet the weight of it never ceased to surprise her, as if each interaction sought to remind her that no matter how far she climbed, the ceiling above her was always glass, fragile and unyielding. The second challenge came as a murmur, a voice from across the aisle. "Excuse me," said a man in his 60s, his salt and pepper hair and leather briefcase marking him as someone accustomed to power. His tone was polite but probing, the kind that disarmed before it dissected. "Are you traveling for business or pleasure?" Lena turned to him slowly, her expression neutral. She could see the unspoken question hanging in the air between them, the curiosity behind his polite facade. It wasn't just a casual inquiry, it was a challenge wrapped in civility, a quiet demand for explanation. "Business," she replied simply, her voice even, giving him no more than what he'd asked for. The man nodded, but his gaze lingered, his eyes scanning her as though searching for evidence to corroborate her answer. When he finally turned away, Lena exhaled quietly, her grip on the armrest tightening. The weight of his curiosity was heavier than it seemed, a reminder that in spaces like these, she was always under scrutiny, her worth measured by the assumptions of others. The third challenge arrived with a thud. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Lena's attention drifted to the luggage handlers outside. She spotted her suitcase instantly, the black leather and gold trim unmistakable even from this height. Her stomach dropped as she saw one of the handlers toss it onto the cart with a casual indifference. The bag landing hard on its side. The impact caused the zipper to split slightly. Her belongings barely contained. Lena pressed the call button above her seat, her calm veneer beginning to crack. Moments later, Rick, one of the attendants, appeared. His expression was lined with impatience even before she spoke. Yes? He asked. His tone clipped. Lena pointed to the window. That's my luggage, she said, her voice steady but firm. It's being mishandled. Rick leaned over to glance out the window, squinting as though the scene requires great effort to decipher. When he straightened, his response was dismissive. It's just luggage, ma'am. It'll be fine. It's not just luggage, Lena countered, her voice sharpening. It's my property, and it deserves to be treated with care. Rick sighed audibly, the sound exaggerated. I'll make a note, he said, turning away without further acknowledgement. Lena watched him go, her chest tight with frustration. The casual dismissal stung more than it should have. Not because it was new, but because it was so predictable. It was always the same. The small indignities that accumulated like snowflakes, light on their own but suffocating in their weight. The fourth challenge came as whispers, sharp and deliberate. As the attendants moved through the cabin, Lena caught fragments of their conversation. Their voices barely lowered. She's probably one of those lottery winners, Claire said, her tone laced with disdain. Either that or she married rich, Rick replied, his chuckle cutting through the air like glass. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they weren't. They didn't see her as a professional, a leader, or a woman who had earned her place. To them, she was an anomaly that needed explaining. Her presence in first class a puzzle that required justification. Lena closed her eyes, her breath steadying as she tried to block out their voices. But the weight of their words lingered, pressing against her chest like a reminder that no matter how far she climbed, she would always be asked to prove that she belonged. The chapter ended with Lena staring out the window, her reflection merging with the clouds beyond. The horizon stretched endlessly, a reminder of how far she'd come, and how far she still had to go. Each challenge felt like a test, each whisper a provocation, daring her to break, to retaliate, to lose the composure that was both her shield and her burden. But Lena didn't break. She didn't lose herself in their noise. Instead, she let the silence grow within her, deep and unyielding, until it became something else entirely, a storm waiting to be unleashed. The plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, cutting through the vast expanse of cloud and sky like a solitary thought piercing the din of a restless mind. Inside the cabin, the world seemed orderly, pristine, an illusion of harmony carefully curated by the airline's polished aesthetic. Yet Lena Marshall could feel the discord vibrating beneath the surface. A silent dissonance that hummed in the glances, the whispers, the subtle shifts of body language around her. The first test of the flight's rhythm came in the form of deliberate neglect. Lena had barely settled into her seat when she noticed the flight attendants moving through the aisle, their trays laden with drinks and warm, comforting snacks. Each passenger in first class was greeted with a kind word, a gesture of accommodation, a practiced performance of hospitality. When the attendants reached Lena, however, the performance faltered. Would you care for a drink? Asked Claire, her voice as thin as a blade. There was no warmth, no trace of the smiles she'd offered to others. Water, please, Lena replied, keeping her tone neutral. Claire returned with the glass, setting it down with a quick, almost dismissive motion before moving on without a word. No refill offered, no pleasantries exchanged. The message was unspoken but clear. You are here, but you are not seen. The second challenge came when Lena reached for her carry-on bag. She had tucked it into the overhead compartment earlier, careful not to inconvenience anyone. But when she stood to retrieve it, a sharp voice cut through the cabin. "Ma'am, please don't block the aisle." "Rick," another attendant, barked. His tone carried no courtesy, only irritation. Lena paused, her hand on the compartment's latch. "I just need to grab something," she said calmly, though the tightness in her chest betrayed her composure. "If it's not urgent," Rick said, folding his arms, "I'd prefer you wait until after service." The words struck her like a slap. Not because they were loud or harsh, but because they were unnecessary. Around her, passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between Lena and Rick. Some seemed curious, others indifferent, and a few looked away entirely. Unwilling to engage, Lena returned to her seat without retrieving her bag. The small act of submission burned like an ember in her chest, its heat stoked by Rick's smirk as he turned to assist another passenger with exaggerated courtesy. The third challenge was more insidious. It came not from the crew but from a fellow passenger seated 2 rows ahead. A woman whose expensive scarf and oversized sunglasses spoke of wealth and self-assurance. The woman turned in her seat, looking directly at Lena. "Excuse me," she said, her tone teetering between politeness and authority. "Are you traveling alone?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications. Lena met the woman's gaze, her expression impassive. "Yes," she replied. The woman nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I just assumed," she began, but let the sentence trail off, unfinished, as though the conclusion were self-evident. Lena didn't respond. She had long since learned that some battles were won in silence, in the refusal to give energy to someone else's ignorance. But even as she turned her gaze back to her book, she could feel the woman's lingering curiosity, the unspoken doubt that clung to the air like humidity. The fourth and most deliberate affront came during the meal service. Plates of carefully arranged dishes were handed out to passengers, each one accompanied by a description of the meal and a touch of ceremony. When Claire reached Lena's seat, her tone was brisk, the plate placed before her with mechanical precision. "Here you go," Claire said, already turning away. Lena glanced at her meal. Unlike the others, her plate was missing its silverware, an oversight that felt more intentional than accidental. She pressed the call button, waiting as Rick appeared with the same impatient expression he had worn earlier. "Yes?" he asked. "I'm missing silverware," Lena said, her voice calm but firm. Rick sighed, his frustration palpable. "I'll get it," he said, disappearing down the aisle. When he returned, he dropped the utensils onto her tray with a clatter. His tone clipped as he muttered, "There you go." "Thank you," Lena said, her voice betraying none of the anger simmering beneath the surface. She picked up her fork, noting how the utensils were hastily wrapped in a napkin that was slightly soiled, the crease of a thumbprint marking its corner. The indignities were small, yes, but they accumulated, like drops of water wearing down stone. By the time the plane began its descent, the tension had grown heavy, settling over Lena like a second skin. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their gazes carrying the weight of judgment, curiosity, and discomfort. Every interaction, every gesture, seemed to reinforce a silent truth she had known her whole life. They see you, but they do not see you. As the wheels touched down, Lena gripped the armrests, her knuckles whitening. She thought of all the ways she could respond, all the words she could say, the arguments she could make. But she stayed silent, the storm inside her growing larger, gathering force. She knew the moment wasn't right. Not yet. As the plane taxied to the gate, Lena adjusted her blazer, her movements deliberate. She knew that this was not the end of the journey, but the beginning. And though the road ahead was fraught with challenges, she also knew one thing with certainty: when the time came, she would be ready to speak. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. The storm was building, and Lena was its quiet center. The plane had landed, but the journey was far from over. The engines whined as the aircraft taxied to the gate, and the cabin filled with the familiar shuffling sounds of passengers unbuckling seat belts, reaching for their belongings, and exchanging pleasantries. For most, the descent marked the end of a routine flight. But for Lena Marshall, the tension in the air was heavier now than it had been at takeoff. The first blow came as Lena stood to retrieve her carry-on bag. She moved with practiced ease, opening the overhead compartment to retrieve the leather case she had packed with care. She was just placing her hand on the bag's handle when Rick appeared again. His presence like an unwelcome shadow. "Ma'am, please don't block the aisle," he said sharply, his voice carrying a weight that didn't match the situation. Lena turned her head slowly, her expression calm. "I'll only be a moment," she replied evenly. Rick's jaw tightened. "We ask that passengers wait until the rows ahead are clear," he insisted, though the aisle was far from crowded. His tone wasn't one of enforcement. It was one of challenge. An assertion of control over a woman he clearly thought didn't belong in this space. Lena's hand tightened on the handle of her bag, her gaze steady. "I understand," she said, her voice clipped, but the air between them bristled with unspoken words. She returned to her seat without retrieving the bag, her composure intact but her patience fraying at the edges. As the passengers began to disembark, Lena waited her turn, watching the flow of bodies moving toward the exit. The flight attendants had returned to their positions at the front of the cabin, their smiles reserved for others, their gazes avoiding hers. When Lena finally reached the exit, Claire was there, her professional mask firmly in place. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her tone flat, her eyes darting past Lena as though already addressing the next passenger. "Thank you," Lena replied, her voice betraying nothing, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. The second trial began at baggage claim. Lena approached the carousel, her eyes scanning the conveyor belt as it rumbled to life. Suitcases tumbled down the chute, each one retrieved by passengers who barely glanced at their possessions before hurrying off. But when Lena's suitcase appeared, she froze. The distinctive black and gold case was unmistakable, its surface now marred by scuffs and scratches. The zipper had been pulled apart in places, leaving the fabric strained and gaping. It was clear the bag had been mishandled, its once pristine exterior now bearing the evidence of careless hands. Lena inhaled deeply, her chest tight with anger. She stepped forward and retrieved the bag, her movements controlled but deliberate. Her fingers brushed over the damage, the uneven texture of the scratches and the jagged edge of the broken zipper. It wasn't just the bag that had been mishandled. It was the dignity she carried with her, the quiet confidence that had been chipped away piece by piece since she stepped into the terminal that morning. The third challenge came as she turned toward the airline service desk. There were only 2 employees stationed there, one of whom was Maggie, the same woman who had checked Lena's ticket at the start of the journey. Maggie's face tightened as Lena approached, the recognition flashing in her eyes like a warning signal. "I need to report damage to my luggage," Lena said, placing the bag on the counter. Her voice was steady, but the weight of the day's indignities clung to her words. Maggie glanced at the bag, then at Lena. "Are you sure this happened during the flight?" she asked, her tone carrying a veneer of politeness that failed to conceal her skepticism. "Yes," Lena replied firmly. "I watched it being mishandled as the luggage was loaded onto the plane." Maggie hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'll need to file a report," she said, reaching for a clipboard. "But just so you know, we can't guarantee reimbursement for every claim." Lena's jaw tightened, the familiar weight of dismissal settling over her once again. "I'm not asking for guarantees," she said, her voice colder now. "I'm asking for accountability." The final affront came as Lena left the service desk, her damaged bag in tow. She had barely taken a few steps when she overheard Maggie speaking to her colleague, her voice low but not low enough. "People like her always think they deserve special treatment," Maggie said, her tone dripping with condescension. The words stopped Lena in her tracks. She turned slowly, her gaze locking onto Maggie, whose face paled as their eyes met. For a moment, the 2 women stood frozen, the tension between them palpable. Then Lena straightened her shoulders, her expression calm but unyielding. Without a word, she turned and walked away, the weight of Maggie's words pressing against her back like a physical force. But as she moved through the terminal, the tension within her began to shift. It wasn't resignation she felt. It was resolved. Lena exited the terminal and stepped into the crisp evening air. The sky above was dark, its expanse broken only by the faint shimmer of stars. She stood still for a moment, letting the cool air fill her lungs, her mind racing with the events of the day. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, scrolling to a message she had received earlier. "They're ready." The words were simple, but their weight was immense. Lena's lips curved into a faint smile. The storm she had carried within her all day was no longer just her own. It was about to be unleashed. Not in anger, but in truth, for the silent weight of racism, the subtle, suffocating threads that wove through daily life, could not remain hidden forever. The stage was set, and Lena was ready. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The airport terminal hummed with its usual cacophony. Rolling suitcases, crackling announcements, the distant chatter of lives intersecting briefly and moving on. Lena Marshall moved through this symphony with quiet precision, her heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that betrayed none of the storm building within her. The weight of the day's events lingered on her shoulders, but it no longer felt heavy, it felt sharp, like the edge of a blade she was learning to wield. The first test came as she approached the baggage claim area, where a small cluster of people in suits stood waiting. They were the unmistakable image of authority. Polished shoes, stiff collars, hands clasped in postures of casual command. At the center of the group stood Michael Hayes, the airline's CEO, his graying hair and tailored suit giving him an air of effortless dominance. As Lena drew closer, their conversation faltered. The group turned toward her, their eyes scanning her as though searching for a context that could explain her presence. Michael stepped forward, extending a hand with a practiced smile. "Miss Marshall," he said, his voice smooth, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you." Lena took his hand, her grip firm but composed. "Likewise," she replied, her tone steady, but even as she spoke, she could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken questions hanging in the silence. Why her? Why here? The second challenge was subtle but deliberate. As Michael introduced Lena to the group, their expressions shifted, some with polite curiosity, others with thinly veiled skepticism. One man, whose name tag read Philip, offered a brief handshake, his smile never reaching his eyes. "So, you're the new investor," Philip said, his tone laced with something Lena couldn't quite name. Condescension, perhaps, or doubt. "That's correct," Lena replied, her gaze steady. "I believe in investing in organizations that have the potential to grow and improve." Philip's smile tightened. "And what drew you to the airline industry?" "It's not the most typical choice." Lena let the question hang for a moment, her calm demeanor belying the irritation building inside her. "Perhaps not," she said finally, "but the potential for impact is undeniable." Philip nodded, but his expression betrayed him. A flicker of dismissal, a silent calculation of her worth. Lena didn't flinch. She had spent a lifetime recognizing those flickers. The moments when someone decided she didn't belong before she had even spoken. The third test came when the focus shifted to the crew members responsible for the day's indignities. Maggie, Rick, and Claire were led into the space by a senior HR representative. Their postures were stiff, their eyes darting nervously between Lena and Michael. Rick's jaw was set, his defiance barely masked by the thin veneer of professionalism. Maggie's hands fidgeted at her sides, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Claire avoided Lena's gaze entirely, her face a mask of strained composure. Michael cleared his throat, his voice taking on a formal tone. "Miss Marshall has brought to our attention some concerns regarding the conduct of our staff during today's flight." Rick shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing. "With all due respect," he began, but Lena raised a hand, cutting him off with a calm authority that silenced the room. "This isn't about respect," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "It's about accountability." Rick's mouth closed, his expression darkening. Lena turned her gaze to Maggie, whose face had gone pale. "Your actions today weren't just unprofessional," Lena continued, addressing the group. "They were harmful. They spoke to a culture of assumption, of bias, that permeates spaces like these. A culture that sees someone like me and questions my worth, my right to be here." The fourth and most pointed challenge came as Lena began to detail her experiences. Recounting the microaggressions and dismissals she had endured throughout the day. The silence in the room grew heavier with each word, the weight of her testimony pressing against the walls like an unrelenting tide. Rick's defiance faltered, replaced by something that looked like shame. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as Lena described the way her luggage had been carelessly handled. The whispers she had overheard, the dismissive tone in every interaction. But it was Philip who finally broke the silence. "I'm sure there was no intention to cause harm," he said, his voice carefully measured, as though trying to smooth over the cracks in the room's fragile veneer. Lena turned to him, her gaze piercing. "Intention doesn't erase impact," she said. "Your team's behavior wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a system that tolerates and perpetuates bias. And that's not something I'm willing to accept." By the time Lena finished speaking, the room was thick with tension. Michael Hayes stepped forward, his expression grave. "Miss Marshall, you're absolutely right," he said. "This incident has revealed serious shortcomings in our training, our policies, and our culture. Effective immediately, we'll be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion programs for all staff. And I assure you, disciplinary action will be taken." Lena inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words but offering no reprieve. She turned back to the crew members, her voice soft but unyielding. "I don't expect you to understand the weight of your actions at this moment," she said, "but I hope, in time, you'll reflect on what this day means. Not just for you, but for every person who's ever been made to feel small." Maggie nodded silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. Rick looked away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own discomfort. Claire whispered an apology, her voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the room's silence. As Lena walked out of the meeting, the storm inside her began to subside. But it wasn't over. The air around her still carried the tension of unspoken truths, of battles yet to be fought. And though the day's events had been a victory, Lena knew they were only the beginning. The terminal stretched out before her, its chaos a stark contrast to the quiet determination she carried within. As she stepped into the evening air, the weight of the day felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because she knew now, more than ever, that she was ready to face it. Justice was slow, but it was moving, and Lena Marshall was its quiet, unstoppable force. The glass doors of the conference room whispered shut behind Lena Marshall as she stepped into the polished chaos of the airport terminal. Outside, the city buzzed with the rhythms of its own life, indifferent to the tension that lingered within her. Inside, the air was heavy, not with silence but with the weight of decisions made and consequences waiting to unfold. Lena moved with purpose, but beneath her calm exterior, a storm churned, a storm that had been building for a lifetime. The first challenge of this new phase came not from the crew, but from the systems designed to protect them. As Lena approached the media briefing room, her assistant, Karen, intercepted her with a tight smile and a clipboard full of notes. "They're already asking questions," Karen said, her voice low. "A few reporters are digging into your background. Some are framing this as opportunistic." Lena's lips tightened. The implication hung in the air. How could someone like her hold the power to challenge an institution like this? "Let them dig," Lena replied, her voice calm but resolute. "The truth doesn't scare me." Karen hesitated, then nodded. "They've prepared a statement," she said, holding out a sheet of paper. "It's neutral." Lena took the paper and skimmed it quickly. It was exactly as Karen described, neutral to the point of blandness. A collection of platitudes designed to deflect rather than confront. She handed it back without a word. "I'll speak my own truth," Lena said, stepping past Karen toward the doors. "Let them hear it." The second challenge came moments later, as she stood at the podium under the harsh glare of the cameras. The room was packed with reporters, their pens poised and cameras trained on her, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and barely veiled judgment. Lena adjusted the microphone, the small gesture steadying her as she surveyed the room. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs in the room. "Thank you for being here today." The opening was simple, but it set the tone. Lena was not there to apologize. Nor to placate. She was there to confront. To illuminate the truths that many would rather leave in the shadows. I stand before you today not just as a passenger who experienced indignity, but as a person who has spent a lifetime navigating spaces where I am seen but not seen. Heard but not understood, she said. What happened on that flight was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem. A culture that tolerates, and sometimes even encourages, the quiet erosion of respect and dignity for people like me. The room remained silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd like a heavy fog. Lena let the pause linger, knowing the power of silence when wielded with intent. The third challenge came in the form of a question. A reporter in the second row, a man with graying hair and a sharp suit, raised his hand. Miss Marshall, he said, his tone respectful but probing. Some might say you're using this incident to draw attention to yourself. What do you say to those who question your motives? Lena's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger but with focus. She stepped closer to the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges. I would say that those people are missing the point, she replied, her voice steady. This is not about me. It's about the thousands of passengers who have experienced similar treatment but lacked the platform to speak out. It's about the systems that perpetuate these behaviors, and the courage it takes to demand change. The reporter nodded, his expression thoughtful, but Lena could see others in the room exchanging glances. The question had planted a seed of doubt, and she would have to work to uproot it. The fourth and most personal challenge came after the briefing. When Lena stepped into a smaller room where Michael Hayes and several senior executives waited. Their faces were tense, their postures defensive, as though bracing for a blow. Miss Marshall, Michael began, his tone measured. We appreciate your candor, but some of the remarks you made were strong. The board is concerned about how this might affect our reputation. Lena arched an eyebrow, her calm demeanor giving way to a flicker of incredulity. Your reputation? She repeated, her voice quiet but sharp. Your reputation was damaged the moment your staff chose to treat me, and countless others, with disrespect. Michael shifted uncomfortably, but Lena didn't relent. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. This isn't just about one flight, or one incident, she said. This is about a culture that has been allowed to fester because people like you are more concerned with optics than with accountability. One of the executives, a woman with a tightly pinned bun, interjected. We've already initiated mandatory diversity training. Quote, training isn't enough, Lena said, cutting her off. Her voice was rising now. Not in anger, but in conviction. Training is the bare minimum. What you need is systemic change. Policies that hold people accountable. Leadership that reflects the diversity of your passengers. And a commitment to ensuring that no one else leaves your flights feeling less than human. As Lena exited the meeting, the weight of the confrontation still fresh in her mind, Karen was waiting for her. How did it go? Karen asked. Lena's expression was unreadable, her thoughts swirling like the clouds she had seen from the plane earlier. It's a start, she said simply. Karen nodded, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the exit. The airport stretched out before them, its chaos a reflection of the world outside. Messy, loud, but alive with possibility. As Lena stepped into the cool evening air, she felt a strange sense of calm. The challenges she had faced that day were not new, nor were they the last she would encounter. But for the first time, she felt something shift, not in the world around her, but within herself. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The night pressed against the city like a weight, its shadows curling into alleys and across sidewalks. Indifferent to the lives unfolding beneath it, Lena Marshall sat in the backseat of a black sedan, the quiet hum of the engine her only companion. The day's events played in her mind like an unrelenting reel, each scene sharper than the last, cutting deeper with every memory. But this was not the weight of defeat. No, this was the pressure of transformation. The slow, deliberate cracking of something long calcified. The first test of the evening came as Lena arrived at her hotel. The lobby was grand, a place meant to inspire awe and imply exclusivity. Yet as she stepped through the revolving doors, the receptionist, a young woman with a crisp uniform and an even crisper smile, hesitated. "Good evening, ma'am," the receptionist said, her eyes flicking over Lena's tailored suit as if searching for something out of place. "Can I help you?" "I'm checking in," Lena replied, her voice calm but firm. She slid her ID and credit card across the counter, watching as the woman's smile faltered ever so slightly. It was the kind of hesitation Lena knew well. The kind that whispered, "Are you sure you belong here?" The receptionist recovered quickly, processing the information with a forced efficiency. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her smile back in place but her eyes avoiding Lena's. As Lena took her room key and walked toward the elevator, she could feel the woman's gaze trailing her. The unspoken questions heavy in the air. Who is she? How did she afford this? The familiar weight pressed against Lena's back. But she didn't turn. She didn't need to. The unspoken judgments had become as much a part of her journey as the steps she took. The second challenge came as Lena prepared for the press conference the next morning. Karen, her assistant, laid out the details, the talking points, the anticipated questions, the calculated risks. But as they sat in the hotel suite, the quiet between them grew heavy with the unsaid. "Lena," Karen began hesitantly, "you know this isn't going to be easy. The media, they're looking for a story. And not all of them will want the one you're telling." Lena met Karen's gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here to make it easy," she said. "I'm here to tell the truth." Karen nodded, but her unease lingered. "They'll push back. They'll frame you as an outsider trying to disrupt an institution." Lena's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Let them," she said. "Disruption is what's needed." The third and most personal challenge came during the press conference itself. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on Lena as she stepped to the podium. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "Good morning," Lena began, her voice steady but weighted. "Today, I stand not just as an investor or a passenger, but as a witness to the ways we fail one another." Her opening was met with silence, the kind of silence that demanded to be filled. Lena let it linger, her gaze sweeping over the room. "The events of the past day are not unique," she continued. "They are part of a pattern. A quiet, insidious culture that says some people are less deserving of respect, less worthy of dignity. It is a culture we rarely speak of, because to name it is to confront it. And confrontation is never comfortable." A murmur rippled through the room, faint but unmistakable. Lena pressed on, her voice rising with each word. "This is not just about one flight, one crew, or even one company," she said. "It is about the systems we uphold, the biases we tolerate, and the humanity we too often overlook." The first question came from a woman in the front row, her notepad poised. "Miss Marshall, do you believe these incidents are truly systemic? Or are they isolated cases?" Lena met the woman's gaze, her expression unwavering. "When the same behavior is repeated across time, space, and individuals, it stops being isolated and becomes a system," she replied. "To call it anything less is to excuse it." The next question was sharper. "Some have said your actions come off as self-serving. How do you respond to that?" Lena's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "Self-serving would be to ignore it," she said, "to let the moment pass and do nothing. Speaking out is not for my benefit. It is for the people who can't, or won't, because they're afraid of the cost." As the conference ended, Lena stepped away from the podium, her heart pounding but her stride steady. The applause was polite, but the undercurrent of resistance was palpable. These were not people eager to embrace change. They were people wary of what change might demand of them. In the quiet of her suite later that evening, Lena sat by the window, staring out at the city below. The lights stretched endlessly, each one a story she would never know. Yet the weight of her own story sat heavily in her chest, pressing against her ribs like a heartbeat. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the messages flooding in, some supportive, others scathing. One stood out, a simple message from a number she didn't recognize. "Keep going. We need you." Lena stared at the words for a long moment, the weight of them settling over her. The fight wasn't over. In truth, it was only just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something shift, not in the world around her, but within herself. The unseen curtain of prejudice that had hung over her life was still there. Its threads tangled and knotted. But Lena knew now, more than ever, that she wasn't alone in pulling it down. And she wouldn't stop until it fell. The morning sun cut through the city, its light refracting off the glass facades of towering buildings and warming the sidewalks below. To anyone watching from a distance, it was a day like any other. But for Lena Marshall, today carried a weight far greater than the sun could ever lift. She stood at the edge of the hotel lobby, her reflection caught in the glossy marble floor, bracing herself for what was to come. The first challenge came not in the conference room or the airport, but in the faces of those who gathered to watch. As Lena approached the stage set up for the public address, a mix of supporters, skeptics, and silent bystanders filled the open square. Their eyes tracked her movements, each gaze holding a question, an assumption, or, in some cases, an unspoken judgment. Lena could feel it, the tension that radiated from the crowd. It was the same tension she had felt all her life. The quiet hum of a country that still grappled with its own reflection. Some faces were open, eager, and hopeful. Others were guarded, their skepticism written in the furrow of their brows and the tight set of their mouths. She stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking against the wooden planks, and approached the podium. The microphone caught the subtle sound of her breath as she leaned in. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. The crowd fell silent, the weight of their anticipation almost tangible. The second challenge came from the questions Lena knew hung in the air. Questions that would not be asked aloud but lingered in the minds of those watching. Why her? What gave her the right? Could someone like her really bring change to something so entrenched? "I stand before you today not as someone who claims to have all the answers, but as someone who has lived the questions," Lena said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. Questions about worth, about belonging, about why some of us are seen as deserving and others are dismissed before we've even had a chance to speak. Her words were measured, but the weight of them landed heavily. In the crowd, a man in his 70s shifted uncomfortably, his arms crossed over his chest. A younger woman nodded quietly, her lips pressed together as though holding back tears. The spectrum of responses was as wide as the history that had brought them all here. The third challenge came when Lena began to name the unspoken truths that had shaped her journey. "Racism is not always loud," she said. "It's not always a slur or a shout. Sometimes, it's a whisper, a glance, a question that isn't really a question. It's being told, over and over again, in ways both big and small, that you don't belong." The crowd stirred. Some nodded, their agreement visible in the subtle movement of their heads. Others looked away, their discomfort plain. Lena pressed on, her voice rising with each word. "I've spent my life navigating spaces where I was seen but not seen. Where my presence was questioned, my accomplishments diminished, my humanity overlooked. And I know I am not alone in this." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't falter. The rawness of her emotion hung in the air, binding her to the crowd in a way that words alone could not. The fourth and most pointed challenge came from the questions that followed. A journalist near the front of the stage raised his hand, his expression sharp. "Miss Marshall, do you believe this incident is representative of the airline industry as a whole? Or are you using an isolated experience to paint a broader picture?" Lena paused, her eyes meeting him. The question was not unexpected, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. "This isn't just about an industry," she said, her voice firm. "It's about a culture. It's about the ways we, as a society, allow bias and prejudice to persist. Not because we support it outright, but because we refuse to confront it when we see it." The journalist opened his mouth to speak again, but Lena held up a hand. "Let me be clear," she said. "This isn't about one company or one flight. It's about every moment when someone like me has been made to feel small. And every system that allows those moments to happen without consequence." As Lena finished her speech, the applause came slowly at first, scattered and uncertain. Then it grew, building in waves until it filled the square. The sound wasn't just for her. It was for the truths she had spoken, the quiet courage of her conviction, and the echoes of change that her words had set in motion. Among the crowd, Lena could see faces shifting, some softening, some hardening, but all engaged. This was what change looked like. She realized. Messy, uncomfortable, and slow. But it was also unstoppable. Back at the airport later that day, Lena passed through the terminal with her head held high. The same spaces that had felt suffocating before now seemed different. Not because they had changed, but because she had. The whispers and glances were still there, but they no longer weighed her down. As she boarded her flight, she noticed the crew watching her. Their expressions were subdued, their movements careful, as though they had been chastened by the events of the past days. Lena didn't speak to them, nor did she need to. Her presence was enough. The final test came as the plane ascended, the clouds stretching endlessly below. Lena stared out the window, her reflection merging with the view beyond. She thought of the stories she had heard, the messages from strangers who had reached out after hearing her speak. One message, in particular, lingered in her mind. "Thank you for saying what I couldn't." Lena closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of her breath. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, she felt the tide turning, the slow but certain pull of justice moving in her favor. As the plane leveled off, Lena opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The world below was vast, complicated, and full of contradictions, but she had faced it, named its truths, and refused to turn away. And that, she knew, was only the beginning.